if a group of lads from Glasgow, of all places, who you've been on a stag weekend with, to Amsterdam, are telling you you're overdoing it, there's probably a good chance you're overdoing it.
Kieron Brady, welcome to the Confidence Credential Couch. Great to have you on. As we ask every guest to start with, what does confidence mean to you?
I think that confidence in the main is a positive and potentially productive emotion and feeling, and it's something that helped me throughout my what was to be a very brief football career. And I do think that in a wider sense it's something that I've been blessed with. Equally, I would acknowledge that at times it can be misplaced, and certainly in respects of being a recovering alcoholic and helping people to go through what I always hope will be long-term sobriety, it's incumbent upon me to make them aware and impress upon them that irrespective of how confident they are in a general sense, that they have arrived at a juncture in their life where, regardless of how much confidence you have, I think you're going to have to get external assistance. But in a general sense, I believe that being confident is something that can not only help people achieve, but it's something that can be contributory to their peace of mind and contentment.
I love that. Right.
So you said it's something you've always had. Where do you think it came from? Is it something that just grew with you as a child, or did you have it as a child? You know,
I would say that it would be much more natural rather than anything that was consciously nurtured. In Glasgow, we have a term called gallus. And gallus is a Glaswegian or West of Scotland term that's used for people who just seem to have that element of edge about them. And they might not always be competent in certain areas, but they certainly create the impression that they could enter into any environment and conduct themselves in a manner that would see them fit in. And I don't know if it's that, but I certainly don't have any reservations or reluctance about going into any particular environment and carrying myself in a fitting manner. And certainly with regards to football, although there was always a confidence, the natural ability that people would say that I was blessed with perhaps eventually started to filter into my thoughts to become some form of default position, and consequently I didn't always have to consciously bring confidence to the fore, because I eventually realised that if somebody put a ball at my feet, I could, within reason, I could do almost anything with it.
I'm pretty keen as a lifelong Sunderland supporter, born in Sunderland, living in Sunderland now, having a business in Sunderland, and watching you in my early years. I want to know a little bit about, from a selfish point of view, where it kind of all started with football, because I want to go through the journey. I want to go from sort of when you're at school with football. You've talked about having that gallus, that confidence from an early age. So really go through the school years when you kind of knew you had the ability, when the ability was seen, and then really take us through sort of chronological order of, and then moving into professional football, and then obviously retiring early at 21 and the years after.
I'm more than happy to do that, Simon, although I should say at this particular point that I do apologise if at any point it comes across as conceited, but the difficulty you have with speaking about being naturally blessed is that there would be much greater acceptance towards people speaking about being naturally gifted if they were a pianist or a violinist. But I think because of the popularity of football, and equally because my career wasn't as prolonged or as successful as it may have been, there's maybe a tendency for people to think, well, how can he speak about being naturally blessed as a footballer because I've never heard of him, or that particular type of thing. And I would also labour the point that because you are naturally gifted in any vocation, it doesn't always automatically mean that you're going to go on and become a person of success, because quite simply, irrespective of how naturally gifted you are, it's always going to have to be wedded to some form of application and attitude. But to go back to the question, growing up in Glasgow, certainly at that particular point, or in Coatbridge specifically, where I was born and reared, playing football was almost expected of you. And I do recall people at school who were not particularly keen on football, who never engaged in that regard, and they were almost seen as some form of social pariah because they were disinclined from engaging. And I was one who was more than happy to take part. My mum would say that in my very early childhood, it was very rare for me to be without a ball. And as much as that stood me in good stead for the career that was to follow, there's probably elements of my childhood now that I look back on and think, well, there was probably other things that I wished I'd pursued. To pick up a guitar, for example, my mum had taken me to guitar lessons, and she recalls that I only stayed at the guitar lessons for 3 or 4 weeks because I wanted the ball back at my feet, not the strings in my hand. And now I would love nothing more than to be able to pick up a guitar and play a few songs. But so the ball was always there. And I was 12 years old. I was in a town, the name escapes me. It was on the Dutch side of the Belgian border. And I was playing for my boys' club team, which was Notts Forest, based just outside Glasgow. And we had played a game, and we were under 12s, and we'd turned up to play the under 12 team of this particular town. And there must have been some breakdown in communication. And when we arrived, their under 15 team were training, and they improvised and decided that we, as the under 12 team, would play their under 15s team. And of course, you have to confront the physical differences, but we beat them 5-1 and I scored all 5 goals. And it was in the immediate aftermath of that game that the head of Notts Forest Boys Club took me to one side and made it clear, in his opinion, that I was going to go on and become a very, very top professional footballer. He laid it on pretty thick. And of course, it was wonderfully encouraging to hear those words at such a young age. The downside of it was that I think my academic pursuits suffered as a result, because it perhaps engendered a complacency in me, where perhaps at the back of my mind I always concluded, well, regardless of how school materialises, I'll always be able to go and play football. And I mean, that was the case in a sense, insofar as when I left school I came down to the northeast of England. But in many respects, you don't always foresee what's going to happen, and that you may have to retire prematurely. And then, of course, academic attainment can be very, very useful. So the football at childhood level, at school level, boys' club level, have provided so many cherished memories. But equally, I should point out that in bringing up my own son, who's now 9, as much as I encourage him with his football development, as much as I embrace the idea of him one day being a professional footballer, it's my responsibility to make sure that he doesn't take for granted that any career might last till he's 30 or 35, because he only has to look at the experiences of his dad to understand that you just never know what could happen.
I think that's valuable life lessons, isn't it? Because I think anybody going into a career will probably speak for the majority of people. You go into it thinking this is going to last forever. You know, I'm going to be at this company, I'm going to be in this profession. You know, and things can, you know, them curves in the road. But to pass that advice down to your son, I mean, it's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, obviously you moved professional contract at Sunderland, first club?
Yes, I had been approached by numerous clubs in Scotland to sign for them when I was leaving school. And I'd also spent considerable time at Chelsea, and they had expressed a desire for me to move to London and enter into a YTS apprenticeship with them. And it was relatively late in the day that Sunderland came to the fore. And I was knowledgeable enough, even as a 15 and 16-year-old, to know that Sunderland were a big football club. They had had past successes, even if by that particular point their fortunes tended to fluctuate quite often. But when I came down here on trial and I started to acquire a familiarity with the people and the place, it certainly had a significant impact on me. And London, as wonderful a city as it undoubtedly is, can be quite daunting and intimidating for anyone, let alone a 16-year-old who's moving so far from home. And I came back down to Sunderland on trial for a second time, by which time they'd expressed a desire for me to sign. And at that particular time, Chelsea had just been relegated from the top flight, what we call the Premier League, into what we now see as the Championship, and Sunderland had been promoted. So it would be very easy to look at Sunderland as a club on the way up and Chelsea as a club who are spiralling. But as it transpired, Chelsea were promoted straight back to the top flight, and I've been there ever since. Whereas Sunderland took a couple of seasons and they managed to get to Division 1 as it was then. But then, of course, over the subsequent 30 years or so, it's been a roller coaster of emotions for Sunderland fans, as you will be able to testify.
Yeah, I'll be able to vouch for that. Yes, I will. So, you go to Sunderland at 16. You spend the next few seasons kind of really getting into the first team.
Yeah.
I suppose pressure-wise, did you feel any sort of pressure on you? Or at that age, were you still that confidence? You know, you're working your way into the first team as well?
Yeah, I mean, I was picked to play for the first team when I was 17. And I was very fortunate that the first game I played at Roker Park, I played very well. And although there wasn't any singing of my name from the supporters, I was still perceptive enough to sense that I was being viewed favourably. And then, of course, when you're in social gatherings and various places, that can be reinforced. And so, as a result of that, when I was playing for the first team, it tended to go well. And I was one who loved being centre stage, and I did begin to realise that I was able to do a lot of things with the ball that other people didn't necessarily attempt to do, and it may well because they were conscious of their limitations, and that's perfectly fine because their role in the team wasn't based around doing the types of things that I could do. But you know, the fans chanting my name wasn't too far in the distant future, and I loved the fact that they were very, I dare say, familiar about it. And you know, it was just a repetition of my first name, Kieron, and you know, I loved that, and that, as it turned out, was the confidence that I needed, much more than perhaps motivation from a manager or a coach, because ultimately, if you can bring entertainment, effect, and do your utmost to make people happy going home from Roker Park, as it was then that's a wonderful thing and a wonderful gift to have. And I loved it, and I feel very blessed, not only in the talent that I had, but I feel very blessed that the affection and affinity that the fans had then to me as a player has persisted to this day with me as a former player. And I've said before that if there was any football club in the world that you could play for a few years but have to injure as a result of have to retire as a result of retirement, and where the people would remember you so fondly and so affectionately, then I believe you would be hard pushed to find anywhere more than Sunderland.
Yeah, and I agree with that from a biased point of view. So tell us about, you've had a couple of successful seasons. You're a fan's favourite. Your name's being chanted. What happens in terms of sort of, because I want you to kind of lead on this, obviously the retirement with a blood disorder. How did you, were you feeling ill, unwell? What kind of triggered that off to, I'm just trying to like lead up to that point of retirement and how things went from there.
Well, when I was 19, just about to turn 20, I did start to experience some infrequent pains in the calf region of my right leg. And it wasn't properly diagnosed. And of course, then it wasn't properly operated upon. But when it started to become much more frequent and much more problematic, I had little option but to persevere and to hammer home to the medical personnel that there was something awry and something that was, having an impact on both my ability to train and my ability to play. And when we came back for pre-season training after the FA Cup final in 1992, because of the rigours demanded of you within pre-season training, it was becoming increasingly evident that something wasn't right. I'd had to drop out of training at times. And it was then, I was explaining the symptoms, which by then had actually went to my foot. So instead of it just being about the pains in the calf, my toes were going extremely cold in my right foot, whereas my left foot seemed to be functioning in the same manner. And so that distinction to, I think, even laypersons would indicate some form of blood disorder. Unfortunately for me, it wasn't diagnosed until December that year, which was about 6 months after I'd been complaining about it. And without being a medical expert, I was also informed that this meant that the blockage had potentially got bigger and bigger, which potentially reduced the prospects of operating or performing particular surgery in a certain way. Nevertheless, despite all of that, I wasn't made aware at any point that my career was in jeopardy, even if the nature of the condition wasn't typical of what you would expect within a professional footballer or athlete. And in the early part of 1993, by which time I'd just turned 21, I had a series of procedures and they had went wrong, and consequently, instead of having a 4-hour procedure where I would have left hospital later that day, I ended up unconscious for 24 hours. I woke up in intensive care on a life support machine and was then in hospital for 2 weeks. So I think what had started off as a procedure to rectify the problems to allow someone to continue a career within professional sport had, over the period of 24 hours, became a series of procedures to try to save the life of a human being and not to give too much consideration to whatever professional career the person has. And so that in many respects was the beginning of the end, because I never played after that. So it was just really then about trying to recuperate and recover, learning to walk again. For anybody that's potentially gone into hospital with some form of impairment or illness or condition where their mobility is impacted upon, quite often the person will be struggling as they go into hospital and then leave hospital in a much better state. I was the opposite. I'd walked into hospital and had been running about to some extent in the days and weeks leading up to it. And by the time I left hospital, I was unable to walk. So it was quite evident to me, even as a layperson, that something had gone drastically wrong. And nobody wanted to confront the prospect of coming to me and saying, look, Kieron, this might mean that your dreams of a glittering and golden career within football are curtailed. But it was a number of months later when the surgeon who had operated on me told me, and in a much more tactful and diplomatic manner than simply saying your career is over, said, I would advise you to find alternative means of employment. So he was very political in his approach, but by that time I was slowly but surely, even if reluctantly, beginning to accept that, you know, the career might be over almost as soon as it had started. But I would also add, living in Sunderland, and despite the fact that the ensuing years were challenging, when I got to my 40s, in fact, maybe even earlier, I began to appreciate the 5 years that I got rather than bemoan the period that I didn't have. And that's reinforced in many senses by living in Sunderland and appreciating that I got to do something for 5 years that so many people in this particular city would love to do just once. And to that end, I think you have to count your blessings.
What if it was that when you got into your 40s that you thought that way? Because I suppose by having a career cut short, you know, ultimately not knowing whether you were going to get through, obviously coming out of the operation, going into hospital, has that taken you a good few years to kind of look back and go, you know what, I really appreciate those 5 years that I had?
Yeah, I mean, when it happened, my mum, you know, and perhaps I was a little bit guilty of accusing her of just being too maternalistic, had suggested that I go and speak with a counsellor, because she understood better than most that the enormity of what was happening might have an adverse impact upon me. And she was right. But I was perhaps far too dismissive of the idea of sharing my emotions. In later years, then, I think as you become, you know, more intelligent, less headstrong, you begin to realise that there might be benefits in sharing certain emotions with people and speaking to people with expertise or lived experience. And certainly once I got sober, I began to see things with much greater clarity and was able to appreciate the things that I have in life, whether it's football or other things, rather than think that life has treated you unfairly and unjustly. And I think with regards to being a footballer, even although I only played till I was 21, even to this day, I'm still the recipient of compliments that aren't always typical of what footballers receive, and things that maybe a lot of football supporters and people within the football fraternity don't always think of. For example, I get people still to this day who'll tell me that they named their son after me, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing more honouring and humbling than somebody who has named their son or their daughter in other cases in honour of you. So I've had people at times say, my little boy's called Kieron, or they might say he's grown up now because it was when you were playing that we'd named him Kieron. And then I recall one individual, and this is only about 3 years ago, who said the same thing to me. He says, I called my son after you. And as I do in situations like that, I thanked him and says, it's very humbling and honouring that somebody would feel you'd made such an impact in their life, despite the fact that you don't know them, and they're prepared to call their son after you. And he then went on to say, he was speaking so affectionately about me. He then went on to say, and not only did I call him Kieron, but his middle name's Brady. And that's taking it too far. So, and I mean, that really is an incredible endorsement of the impact that you can have on people. And
I think self-gratitude's a wonderful thing as well.
When you hear things like that, I mean, it's breathtaking in many respects, because, again, going back to what I'd said earlier, that wouldn't happen at all football clubs and with all football supports.
Yeah.
And when we think of things that do distinguish Sunderland fans, for example, then these are just perhaps some of the little instances and examples that perhaps, I wouldn't say make them unique, but certainly make them different in a sense from many others.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly ask, just put it on a bit of a timeline for those who aren't as intimately involved with Sunderland, and I myself confessed I'm probably one of the worst kind of non-fans, as I like to see all North East teams do well.
That's fair.
I get a lot of mick taken out of us by both friends who are Sunderland fans and friends who are Newcastle. But the question is, what timeline in terms of years was the playing? You talked about your age, but what decade was it? And the years for those who...
It was. I came down to Sunderland in the summer of 1988, and ironically enough, the first town that I came to in Sunderland was Bolden, because we had driven.
Where was that now?
Yeah.
I came as a passenger with the Scout who operated in Glasgow and surrounding areas, and he had brought me down to Sunderland. And I, at that particular point, had no idea that Sunderland was actually on the coast. And we came down in July, and my first impressions of Sunderland was when he'd said to me, "That's us in Sunderland now," and it was Bolden. And as we drove through the main street in Bolden and I looked around, I thought, oh, this is a nice place. And then we made our way further in, and we came to Fulwell, and then to Seaburn, and then along the coast towards Roker. And we were in the midst of a heat wave, and
it's looking at its best.
The beaches were packed with these semi-bronzed, scantily clad 16 and 17-year-old girls, and I thought, I'm signing here, So between Bolden and my first impressions of the coast, I wasn't sure if we'd only travelled 2.5 hours from Glasgow. And so it certainly created a very favourable first impression. But without being too flippant about it, it was much more to do with the attitude, demeanour, disposition, if you like, of the people that I encountered in those periods. And it wasn't strictly or exclusively the football personnel, it was the people you would meet out and about. And what I began to realise was that there was probably much more in common between the people of the North East and the west of Scotland than whatever issues there are that would divide them. So in many ways it was a home from home, even if of course I wasn't surrounded by family. But that certainly made it easier. And I think by the time it got to me making a decision about where my immediate footballing future lay, the majority of influences within my family were leaning towards Sunderland as opposed to going to London to play for Chelsea. And of course it was to Sunderland that I came. So I was there from 1988 until the age of 21 in 1993 when I couldn't play any longer. And, you know, like I was very young, obviously, when I was playing for the first team. So much so that the majority of the games that I played for Sunderland's first team, I was still eligible to play for the youth team. So that alone probably gives an insight into just how young and immature I was, because when you're 18 and 19, you will make mistakes and engage in things that you may not when you're 29, and certainly not when you're 39 or older. So I think Dennis Smith, to give him credit, was conscious of the fact that teenage footballers will at times transgress, and he was never too damning in that regard, although he always felt that some form of sanction might be suitable. But it was all part of your personal and professional growth, and at times he could be particularly hard on me, and I've spoken to him since about it. We had an interesting conversation, ironically enough, within the media room at St James's Park, where our professional careers in broadcasting had crossed. And, you know, we reminisced about being at Sunderland, him as a manager, me as a young player. And I, you know, made it clear to him that I could have conducted myself better at times, and that I couldn't always simply apportion it to the folly of youth. And he, to his credit, acknowledged that he could have managed certain situations better, and that he found it difficult at times to know just how to get the best out of, you know, someone with talent. And he was very, very complimentary about me in his autobiography. You know, he spoke about me. He basically says I was a genius. You know, and I don't think you can really get in any walk of life something that's more complimentary than that, especially from someone who had managed so many players. And the irony was that he compared me to two players, and the two players were Paul Gascoigne and George Best, two alcoholics, you know. And at this time he wouldn't have known that alcoholism had also befallen me. So there's just a nice little anecdote there.
I think that leads nicely on, because I've got a couple of questions here. I really want to know how on earth you cope with having to retire at the age of 21 and how that affects you mentally. And you've mentioned alcohol. And so there's a couple of things. I want to know how that affected you mentally, retiring at 21. And when did alcohol start to become a problem? Because I'm trying to work out here, you know, was it kind of leading up to before you retired or after?
No, I mean, what you referred to there latterly is very valid and very relevant, because the question I'm asked most by people with regards to my alcoholism is if I think I'm an alcoholic because my dreams were dashed at such a young age and this golden career that so many people had predicted for me failed to materialise. And there may well have been a period in life where I would have allowed self-pity to dictate the answer and say, well, yes, the reason I'm an alcoholic is because I suffered so much professional trauma when I was barely out my teens. But that would be a lie. You know, when I now know what I know of alcoholism, when I now know about the thinking components of it, as well as the drinking aspects, I believe that I've been predisposed to being an alcoholic from the moment I was born. And I think what life events can do, particularly adversity, can contribute to when the individual in alcoholism will come in to significant, severe and serious collision. And in the immediate aftermath of having to retire, it would be easy to understand anyone, perhaps even myself, saying I turned to drink in order to cope. But so much of recovery from alcoholism is about a capacity to be honest And to that end, I'm still in recovery, and therefore I have to be honest. And in doing so, I would have to acknowledge that in the year or two prior to having to retire, my relationship with alcohol was becoming increasingly problematic. It wasn't always manifest in 3 or 5 day drinking binges, but the thinking component and the priority I was given to that relationship with alcohol was certainly becoming quite toxic. One of the best examples I can give is that I come from an Irish family, and as a result of family influence, I opted to play for Ireland instead of Scotland. And I played for Scotland at schoolboy level and was extremely honoured to do so. But I was then picked to play for Ireland when I came to Sunderland. And we would get an itinerary sent through from the Football Association of Ireland, which would tell us what we were going to be doing, when the game was going to be, where it was going to be, all of those different things. And I was immensely and immeasurably proud to play for Ireland, as were my family. But by the time I got to 20, and I was being picked to play for Ireland, and I was being sent through the same type of documentation about the upcoming game, my instinctive reaction was to look at the kick-off time of the game. Now, the reason I was doing that is because I wanted an early as possible kick-off time to allow for a longer day and night out in the pubs or the clubs of whatever city we were happening to be playing in. So it could be Dublin, of course, if we're playing at home. At times it was, over in Seville or Portugal, Switzerland, wherever the case may be. And in looking back, I can now realise that my relationship with alcohol then was deteriorating in the context of an illness. So any idea that I'm an alcoholic because of some seminal event in life, even if particularly adverse or traumatic, is wrong. I believe that any alcoholic has been predisposed to it from the moment they're born. And that, of course, has the potential to come across as insensitive. And that's not what I'm saying, because many alcoholics go through hellish and horrific trauma in addition to their alcoholism, and go through trauma that far eclipses or surpasses what I did. But I do believe that it's life events that can bring the alcoholic and the alcoholism into collision. But if I had went on and had a wonderful career and made a lot of money, won a lot of silverware, been incredibly popular to the point of being adored by the masses of the population, I would still have been an alcoholic. If you don't believe me, ask Matthew Perry, ask Shane McGowan, ask George Best, ask Paul Gascoigne, because they had all of the aforesaid, and irrespective of what possessions and materialism and adulation they had from the broad public, they were still alcoholics or are still alcoholics.
I kind of, I go back to, we've talked on the podcast and I've spoke openly about this as well, where I had 3 years sober, and I know, I'm with you, because I look at my childhood and being around my parents, there was parties going on, and like I look back and kind of thought, I wouldn't suggest I was an alcoholic, but I certainly used alcohol in the wrong way at times, and it got worse when my dad died. I just know it got way worse, because I completely understand that. At what point do you? Because I got to a point with alcohol where I was like, this has to stop. There's no like dry January here. This has to be this has to be cut out. It's harming myself and everybody around me. At what point do you realise? Do you kind of, because it was 2009 you've been sober since? Yeah,
June the 13th, 2009.
At what point between kind of, your early 20s and up to 2009, do you kind of realise that there's a problem here and there's something and you need to do something about it? And what were the steps, the stages?
Well, first of all, alcoholism is medically accepted as an illness. And when people can come to terms with that, it becomes much more easier to understand and to explain and hopefully educate and empower others. And when my alcoholism was primarily affecting other people as opposed to me, even if I was the one that had to suffer the nightmare of the hangover and the mental torture that would last for half a day or a day or so, it was certainly having an impact on other people. But alcoholics tend to be selfish. And there's very few alcoholics who will give serious consideration to both stopping drinking and staying stopped unless it's having an adversarial impact upon them. And even at that, if the implications of it are physical, they will tend to see it through and, ride it out and perhaps persist in drinking. I only gave serious contemplation to doing something meaningful and sustainable about it when I was starting to become paranoid and depressed and anxious and frequently suicidal. But more often than not, I would go back to drinking the following week or within a couple of weeks or on odd occasions a couple of months, because I simply didn't appreciate the enormity of what was actually afflicting me at that particular time. And I, in looking back, had various times in life where it becomes much easier to deduce that alcohol has taken on such a role in your life that it is rendering people, employment, and so many other facets and features of what should be your priorities as secondary. And despite the fact that I was given an ultimatum in my personal life from my now wife, it was alcohol that won the day. I could tell her how much I loved her, how much I valued her, and that she was more important than alcohol. But that's just verbalising it. She, by that particular time, didn't care too much for my words or my intentions. She was wanting to see things that were action-based. And my actions within a matter of hours was holding a bottle of wine. And, she only had to look at the evidence to see, well, Kieron, irrespective of what you say to me, irrespective of whether you love me or not, it's perfectly clear and becoming patently obvious that alcohol is becoming the most important thing in your life. And I would always encourage any alcoholic who's thinking about recovery to be unashamed in thinking, is alcohol more important to you than, for example, your children? And of course, what people tend to do is respond by saying, no, there's nothing as important as my child. And the rational person inside them, the decent, caring human being that I believe is in almost every alcoholic, will mean it when they say that their children or their partner, their family, their job, their house, their responsibilities are more important. But what they don't always appreciate is that they have what in many ways is an alter ego that lives within them. And once that comes to the fore, it tends to win the day. And the manipulative, deceitful, duplicitous person comes out. And, there was a number of things happened in the period that you outlined, Simon, into my 20s, into my early 30s, that really reinforced that my relationship with alcohol was going way out of control. I mean, I went on a stag weekend to Amsterdam with my friends from Glasgow, and we were there for 3 or 4 days. And the norm is that on a stag weekend, everybody's an alcoholic, So we went to Amsterdam, and as we were returning home, a couple of my friends who I've known since childhood had said, Kieron, you're going to have to do something about your drinking. It's way, way, way out of control. And there's always a tendency, particularly within males, to sense it or see it as a badge of honour. When somebody says that you're such a big drinker, and it's a wonderful reflection of your masculinity. And in hindsight, and looking back to that conversation that I had with my childhood friends, if a group of lads from Glasgow, of all places, who you've been on a stag weekend with, to Amsterdam, are telling you you're overdoing it, there's probably a good chance you're overdoing it. Because you put all of those ingredients together and you kind of think that it's impossibility to do anything to excess. And then, of course, in the ensuing years, there might be periods where it would renew some hope within my wife or my mum, my brother, my sister, etc., that perhaps things were improving. But that never sustains. And when I was working within the field of anti-discrimination and equality, I was invited to 10 Downing Street, and I was going to be recognised for the work that I had been engaged in promoting equality and social justice. And by that time, my alcoholism was starting to take a much firmer hold. And I had given assurances to the people that I was travelling with that I would abstain from alcohol during our time. And I hadn't had a drink for about 6 to 8 weeks at that particular point. But alcoholism is a very adept way at convincing you, particularly at specific times, that if anybody deserves a drink, it's you. And of course, if I'm going to be recognised within the corridors of power in one of the world's foremost political residences for this morally sound work that I've been involved in challenging prejudice and discrimination, then if anyone deserves a wee drink to celebrate, then it's me. And so we arrived at King's Cross on the day, and we were due to go into 10 Downing Street at 6:15 in the evening, and it was a gloriously hot summer's day, and they had decided to have the function in the back garden as opposed to in one of the function suites. And we had went to a pub, myself, Gary Bennett, numerous other ex-footballers, managers, etc., that was quite close to 10 Downing Street, and we'd went there about 4:30, and in the next hour or so, or 4 o'clock, or in the next 60 minutes or 90 minutes just prior to going into number 10, they would have had 2, perhaps 3 drinks, and I'd had maybe 5 or 6 pints within that period of time. We then went through the security protocols and into Downing Street, and then deciding to have the function in the back garden, they also had a free bar. And I was more than happy to take advantage of their boozy benevolence. And I conducted an interview on Downing Street TV, and in all accounts I came across exceptionally well in speaking about the work I'd been involved in and the various difficulties and challenges around racism, homophobia, sexism, etc. But anybody who drank with me would tell you that one of the traits that I often displayed when I had indulged too much was that I would seem perfectly fine and articulate 1 minute, and then within a very short period of time I would be slurring my words with my eyes rolling back in my head, and my language perhaps having become much more expletive laden. And of course, any of my colleagues, and certainly the boss of the organisation, would say, I couldn't have picked a worse moment, Kieron, for you to make that particular transition, because it was at that particular point that you were being introduced to members of the cabinet and the Prime Minister. And I'm told, which obviously means that I can't recall, I swore at Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister, and I subsequently decided that I didn't want to be around the political elite because I don't particularly have any time for New Labour. And I then went back through the security protocols out into the pubs and clubs of London, having left my bag unattended in 10 Downing Street, which couldn't be accounted for, which consequently caused a security breach, which was kept from the media, thankfully. And you know, I've made amends to my boss for that, because it was particularly mortifying for him, because he had created the anti-discrimination organisation Show Racism the Red Card in a very admirable and a very credible way. And when I got sober, I went through to Whitley Bay and I met him and I made amends for it. And by that time, with the passing of time, it had perhaps taken on a more light-hearted perspective. But my alcoholism wasn't simply measured or demonstrated by what unfolded in 10 Downing Street that particular evening. I woke up at 6:30 in the morning, about 12 hours after, at the hotel we were staying in. And whereas many people who have potentially embarrassed themselves in some sort of public function or social gathering might feel a sense of regret and shame about what may have unfolded the previous evening, I could only experience one thought at 6:30 in the morning, and that was, I need a drink. And so I looked out the hotel window and I noticed there was a general dealer's just opposite the main reception area. And I went down, and by this time it might have been 7 o'clock, and I went in to the shop, and fortunately, at the time, and given the mind I had, they were prepared to sell alcohol. And I bought 4 cans of Stella. And then I thought, I don't want to go back and sit in hotel reception, because if some of my work colleagues come down, they'll think that I'm adding insult to injury, given what had happened the previous evening. So I went into a local park and sat on a park bench on a day like today, blue skies, glorious sunshine, and sat drinking my 4 cans of Stella. And I was wearing, I think, jogging bottoms with shoes. You know, I was hardly looking like a walking fashion statement. And of all the people that walked by me over the course of that period, you know, people walking their dog, people making their way to work in and around London, people perhaps taking children to school. It's very, very hard, in fact, I believe it impossible, to think that all the people who perhaps looked at me sitting on a park bench at 7 o'clock in the morning with 4 cans of Stella could imagine that 12 hours previous, I was wearing a 3-piece suit, conducting myself very well in an interview in 10 Downing Street. Alcoholics are exceptionally good or bad at building a very productive and positive career for themselves, and being blessed with this curse, or cursed with this curse, that they can deconstruct it in such a short, catastrophic period of time. And I suppose that particular 12-hour period back in May 2008 is another example of the descent that I was. And of course I lost my job because of that. You know, so I was taken to an event where I was to be honoured and recognised for the work that I'd done, and it culminated in me losing the job that I was doing. And that, you know, when I look back to things like that, and certainly the period about a year or so later when I had my last drink, you know, and I was suicidal again, and you know, it's very easy when you're suicidal, and you're suicidal repeatedly. You look skywards and you think, why are you, you know, why is this happening to me? Or why are you doing this to me if you're a believer? And, you know, I would always encourage people to just persist, to get help if you need it, to do what's recommended, so that you're able to, at some point at a later date, look back to that particular day or that particular period and come to the conclusion that it wasn't merely happening to you, it was happening for you. And when I think back now to a lot of those times that I was suffering, I was suicidal, depressed, paranoid, anxious, manic. I can now look back and think that they were all part of a process of learning. And when I got sober, you're encouraged to go on a voyage of self-discovery, which includes visits to memory lane, and all of which I believe is instrumental in creating perhaps what you see today, and being able now to go and pass that wisdom on and that experience to benefit others. And it's wonderful to have thousands and thousands and thousands of people chanting your name, particularly when you're only a teenager. But it doesn't come close to somebody walking up to you and embracing you in such a manner because it's the first time you've seen them since 3 days previous when you talked them down off a bridge. Because entertaining thousands and thousands and thousands of people is a wonderful thing to be able to experience. But saving someone's life and the person now being 4 years sober and enjoying life and still having the gratitude for what was given to him has a purity to it that perhaps doesn't exist within the whole sphere of entertainment or professional sport. But I just feel blessed that I've been able to do both, whereas many people might not get the chance to do either. Being an alcoholic has been a blessing for me. You know, it's strange it might seem surreal for people to acknowledge that because it's a killer to so many people. But it does offer you the possibility to not only never drink again, but to become a much more grounded, well-balanced, happy and at peace individual.
What was that? What was the tipping point? So between 10 Downing Street, what went on there, and the following year going sober, what was the tipping point, and did you seek help? Did you do it on your own? How did that come around?
No, I mean, I had went and sought the assistance of people who are well versed in recovery from alcoholism, i.e. alcoholics. I would still be of the firm view, and this is where alcoholism would have a uniqueness in many ways, that the best people to help an alcoholic to recover are other alcoholics. Not just any alcoholic, but people who have gone through their own process of recovery and self-discovery. And I was told, but also realised, that if you try to do this alone, the chances of success, and when I say success, I don't just mean living a life free from alcohol. I mean having the opportunity to try to go and, as best as possible, make amends to people who have been hurt and harmed by your actions, bringing about a much more spiritual outlook on life without necessarily being religious. I think you need assistance in doing all of those things. You know, people might read books and they might say, well, I'm doing it. But even if you read a book, you're still getting the wisdom of others. So I would always say to people, do not try and do this on your own, especially when there's help, more or less on your doorstep. So I went and I got help, but even that wasn't enough in the early stages, because there's always the risk that when you go and get help, people aren't always going to get help to stop drinking and stay stopped. They might, as I possibly did. And the other thing that a lot of people do with regards to alcoholism is when they go and get help, they're doing it at the behest of someone else, because we're all familiar. If any of us woke up tomorrow morning with a physical ailment and we were in pain, it might be someone else close to us that says you should go and see the doctor about that. Now, alcoholism doesn't just have symptoms. Alcoholism, unlike many other conditions or illnesses, has drastic consequences, because often these come through drunkenness and being completely impaired. So my wife had got to the stage, my mum at times was getting irate with me when I was drinking, when I went to Glasgow or at the family home in Ireland, that I was going to have to do something. And, you know, the instinctive thought for many people is, well, I'll cut down how much I'm drinking. But of course, an alcoholic's incapable of doing that. They might have a successful shelf life with it that might span a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, but ultimately it will end up reverting to type. So my wife had basically, you know, the term she used about my alcoholism was that I exhausted her. And I didn't always appreciate that. At times when I was disappearing for a day here or 3 days there, she was worried sick. And I always, when I was coming to terms with the fact about how much I might have hurt or harmed her, I used to just think almost exclusively around me being verbally aggressive or sarcastic or quite cutting and showing her hostility when all she had shown me was love. I didn't fully appreciate all of the times that I was away enjoying myself, but she didn't know where I was. And she, at times, being a worrier by nature, would consistently be looking at the phone, worrying if it was going to ring to tell her that I was in a police station or a hospital or a morgue. And when I started to come to terms with that, you realise the enormity of what you've put the people closest to you through. Now, of course, it's an illness, it's the driving force of it, but nobody ever had to hold me at gunpoint and put alcohol into my system. And by that time, I'd came to terms with the fact that I was an alcoholic, so there was some moral responsibility on me. I would always argue the point that I have no control, that no alcoholic has control over being an alcoholic. But in the position that I'm in now, I have a social, family, moral, personal responsibility to my own recovery. If I pick up a drink tomorrow and others or I experience the implications of that, that's on me. I have to take responsibility for that. So I think with the increasing suicidal ideation, the anxiety, the sense of loss that was coming from people becoming increasingly detached from me, I think all had a part to play in making me think this cannot go on. You know, this is unsustainable. Something is going to have to give. And I went back to the people who had been so kind and trying to help me previously. And at times you feel a little bit embarrassed and sheepish about returning because your perception is that they've tried to help you and you've disregarded their advice and wisdom and time. And of course, they're only too familiar with the fact that alcoholism isn't easy to deal with and it's not easy to combat. And at times an alcoholic, despite their best efforts, will drink again because all it takes is a moment of weakness, or alcoholism being ever vigilant to try and capitalise on when you might be at your most vulnerable. But I realised that I had to go back and I had to be much more proactive in bringing about change, because sobriety is about change, you know, and it's about honesty, it's about growing humility. And I really thought this time I have to really listen and act in accordance with what the suggestions are. And I've done that. I've continued to do it since the middle of June 2009. And God willing, in June this year, I'll be 15 years sober.
Well done. Phenomenal.
Yeah. I mean, just on that, Simon, I appreciate the compliments but to provide encouragement for anybody who's listening that may have a problem with alcohol, or who may have someone in their family or their circle of friends who is an alcoholic, getting from 10 years to 15 years, if you've done things properly, is a walk in the park. And even getting from 1 year to 2 years sober can be easy as long as you've done things adequately. For me, the real credit lies with the people who are getting from 6 days sober to 7, because then they're still fettered to the idea that alcohol has a place in their life and it provides meaning. So when you've done things properly, and I believe that the people I was surrounded by are wonderfully talented at bringing recovery into the lives of alcoholics. And I would like to think that I've learnt from them and tried to impart that wisdom onto others. And, you know, when you experience that, and they always made the point to me that, you know, believe it or not, Kieron, at times, once you're comfortable in your own sobriety, you'll probably wish that you were only 2 or 3 years sober, because you'll realise that you've got so many benefits and advantages to come. And, you know, almost everything they'd said has materialised. And whether it's the stigma, whether it's the very real social and family repercussions that comes with alcoholism, it still remains true to this day, I believe, and I'm a firm believer, that as well as you can benefit from the medical expertise of psychologists and counsellors, there is something special in the communication that exists within two people who have shared lived experiences, and one having gone through a process of recovery is positioned perfectly to help that other one do likewise.
Just, you mentioned when we asked the question about confidence, being naturally confident, but don't assume that confidence is going to help you on the journey with alcoholism. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Well,
because
yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that we'd frequently speak of in recovery, that being that some of the people that I have communicated with, at times offered counsel or advice to, have been disinclined from accepting it. And I believe that part of the reason for it is because they've gleaned so much confidence from what they've achieved in their personal and professional life, that has allowed them to form an opinion that they can overcome any challenge through their own will. Now, their own will might have served them exceptionally well in terms of developing a career or becoming a prominent figure within a business community. But as we repeatedly tell people, particularly those in positions like that, misplaced confidence is the death warrant of many alcoholics. And just because someone is successful, just because someone has drive within their professional existence, just because there may well be accolades and achievements as part of that, doesn't mean that they're going to be able to stop drinking and stay stopped. I mean, I suppose what would reinforce it is that in the years that I have been helping alcoholics, the alcoholics that I help and have helped are not people who are resident on a nightly basis on a park bench or who are under the care of the Salvation Army. Some of the people that I've helped are doctors or mental health specialists, or on one occasion, a person that I gave advice to who had came was someone who was a university lecturer on alcoholism. And these are people that you could understand or forgive for thinking, well, because of what I've achieved, because of who I am and what I've done, I will be immune from alcoholism. No, it doesn't work like that. So having confidence, I still believe, but I did make it clear at the very beginning. I did say in the main, and I believe that that's very important to add, because confidence can be misplaced, and in the context of alcoholism, it can be deadly. And there's obviously a fine line at times between confidence and arrogance. And the one thing you don't want to have if you're an alcoholic is to be particularly arrogant, because it will stifle and suppress your chances of long-term, sustainable, peaceful, meaningful sobriety. So that you can be confident. Of course, I still think that it's good when people are confident, but there always has to be balanced or coexist with a degree of humility as and when needed, or a willingness to learn, or an acceptance of what's befallen you. And it isn't always easy to say to someone, like this hypothetical figure that might have been very successful, well, look where you were, look at your relationship with alcohol 20 years ago. And was it worse than 15 years ago? Well, yeah, it was. I was 15 years ago, I was drinking a lot more. What was it like 10 years ago? Well, I'd actually went 15 years ago from drinking 3 days a week to 10 years ago I was drinking 5 days a week. And where were you 3 years ago or last year? Well, I'm drinking every day. I'm missing work. The business has suffered. My wife or husband's threatening to leave me. I said, well, this is a progressive illness. Any progressive illness gets worse over time, which means that the symptoms will become much more intense. In all likelihood, the drinking will increase. And the repercussions of all of that are you will start to experience different forms of loss in your personal life, your professional life, even your social life, because you may feel the people that were happy to acquaint themselves with you once upon a time ago have increasingly seen you as some form of outcast, that you are no longer the life and soul you once were. You're much more angry, angst-ridden, emotionally charged, and that's all an indicator of a progressive illness. In much the same way, many of us will have perhaps elderly family members who are unfortunately suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia. And if a family member is speaking to a medical professional for a diagnosis, the medical professional might say, I'm afraid to say that they're in the early stages of, in whatever particular illness. And that's because that particular illness is progressive. So it has early stages, it has mid stages, it has late stages. And alcoholism is not only recognised as an illness, it's recognised as a progressive illness. And in my experience, most alcoholics will only give serious, sustainable contemplation to the notion of long-term sobriety once they're in the mid to late stages. If it's an alcoholic who's still getting to work every single day, a functioning alcoholic as we would term it, then there might not be any impending sense of loss that would act as a driving force to get them to consider whether the relationship with alcohol is becoming problematic. I also think within our country and within our culture, and this would be particularly relevant in places like the northeast of England or the west of Scotland, or of course where my family come from in Ireland, excessive alcohol use does have some form of social and cultural approval. And consequently, it can be difficult at times to distinguish between who might be an alcoholic and who might not, because people perhaps justifiably can say, well, I go out on a Friday night and a Saturday night, and they'll of course try and vindicate themselves by saying I worked hard all week. And I don't have any issues at all with people drinking alcohol. The issue isn't alcohol, the issue is alcohol and me. And even then, that doesn't factor in that it's how I think and my inability to deal with life on life's terms that has been a huge factor in my alcoholism. When an alcoholic's in active alcoholism, alcohol isn't the problem. Alcohol is the solution. Life is the problem. And alcohol is medicinal for that. And when I was meandering round to an off licence at 1 minute to 10 on a freezing cold, stormy January evening, whilst just wearing shorts, trainers and a t-shirt, and I would get to the last corner before I turned round to the off licence, and as I was getting to the last corner, I wouldn't know whether the off licence had closed or it was still open. And I was going to the off licence for what had then became my medicine to get me through the night. And when I would walk round that last corner and I would see the neon light still flashing, I would experience an emotion of indescribable elation, euphoria, and relief that what I needed in that moment was still available. That's before I've taken the drink, right? Now, that is alcoholism. When the extremes of almost any emotion that I experienced from the age of 16 up to 37 involved alcohol. So love, everything had alcohol as a central component to it. Now, if somebody's experiencing that, then even if they're in the wilds of denial, then I would love to think that at some point there'll be a window of opportunity. They come to their senses and they think, when I think about so many emotions I experience, when I think about so many problems I've encountered, when I think about the arguments I have with people, the implications of my professional life, and yet there seems to be this thing that is central to all of it, and it's alcohol. Well, it may well be that you're afflicted with alcoholism. And you know, that's not only so many of the experiences that I encountered, but it's also what I deal with now when I'm trying to help others.
I can so relate. You know, you talk about the confidence and that other word. I was thinking the word when you said it, the humility. And I think that's it's perhaps a hurdle or something to learn.
Yeah.
In that, I mean, my dad, Irish, drank all his life, and I look back exactly that. He was medicating with alcohol. And I look back and I think there was a depression there.
Yeah.
Quite possibly before the alcohol, but it was brought up Northern Irish, that's the culture, you know, and I've fallen into that culture in my life, but also when I go visiting. And he drank himself to death. But he never opened up or there was a pride there. Do you know what I mean? There was a sort of a strong, silent, never said a thing. And that change, perhaps just let the pride go and a bit of humility to accept.
Absolutely. And, you know, there's a reason why a well-worn phrase throughout the ages is that pride comes before a fall. And I was speaking about this only last night in recovery, that in the context of alcoholism, pride doesn't merely come before a fall. It can often come before the final fall. And the biggest demographic that I tend to find who are hard to reach with regards to alcoholism is males who have perhaps been brought up in environments or communities or neighbourhoods where they have laboured under this illusion of what a man is or what a man should be. And not only do I believe it to be erroneous, I believe that it's potentially dangerous and deadly. Because I've lost count of how many men I've worked with who it becomes increasingly difficult to get them to divulge what they feel. They can tell you who they've fought, they can tell you how much they've drank, they can tell you how many women they've cavorted with, but try to get them to tell you that they're scared or they're worried or there is something in their life that they've arrived at that they're finding it very difficult to overcome using their own will or skill set is exceptionally difficult. And I've been to too many funerals of people like that to think that it's just a mere coincidence, you know, and it's tragically sad. And, you know, when we speak about mental health, when we speak about male mental health, and we speak about the obstacles that have to be overcome to try to reduce exceptionally worrying figures, then altering the preconceived ideas that people have of what it is to be a man is a huge undertaking in that regard. But it's something that has to be pursued. It really does. From what I do, I'm just a very, very small cog in a huge and purposeful wheel. The benefit I have, and it's easy perhaps at times for people to look upon what I do and laud me for it, but I always want to labour the point that there's a lot in this for me. Even when people say, that one of the keys to happiness is helping other people, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to do. If you can engage in some form of undertaking that has benefits for you and someone else, is a wonderful thing to be part of, and it doesn't have any drawbacks. I mean, I had someone phone me about, I was taken aback. I didn't recognise the number. They had been past my number, and I picked up the phone. This is about three and a half years ago, and they says, "Is that you, Kieron?" I said, "Yeah," and he told me his name, and it didn't register quickly. And he says, I really, really want to thank you. And I was thinking, what? I want to thank you for giving me my daughter back. And, when you get telephone calls like that and comments like that, it still has the ability, despite the fact I've been doing this for a lot of years, to completely take your breath away, that someone feels that degree of gratitude for you. It can be quite comical at times. I'll tell you one particular anecdote. This is from about 2 years ago. People might call me at times, or they might be given my number without necessarily knowing that I'm an ex-Sunderland player. So they'll be calling me for help with the relationship with alcohol. So somebody had been told or I'd called this person one day and I'd said, I can't remember their name, but it was somebody in Sunderland. I says, "Hi John, my name's Kieron, I'm calling with regards to what I understand to be a problem with alcohol." "Oh yeah, I have." And he says, "But you've caught me now." He says, he says, "It's a certain time and I'm actually going to start my shift at work." And I says, "Look, that's okay." I says, "You've got my number now. Just give me a call tomorrow and we'll continue where we've left off." And he says, "That's perfectly fine." So the following morning he phoned me, and I was in the shower. So my phone rang out and it went onto my voicemail. Now my voicemail says, "Hi, this is Kieron Brady. Unfortunately, I can't take your call at this moment in time. If you'd like to leave your name and number, I'll get back to you as soon as I can." So obviously, when he heard the voicemail message, it gave my full name. Now, the guy was a big Sunderland fan, and obviously he hadn't realised when they'd spoken. So I came out the shower and I picked up, you have one message, a voicemail. So I realised, I maybe had seen the number and thought, that's the guy I spoke to yesterday, and I'm about to listen to him. And so instead of saying, "Oh yeah, hello, we'd spoken yesterday about my problem with alcohol," it was, "Oh, Kieron, you never told me who you were. Oh, I remember this game." And I thought, "Oh, Jesus." And, so sometimes it doesn't all, it has, there's unintended but slightly humorous implications to what I do. But for everyone like that, where it takes a different direction than its intention, there's a lot more good stories, because you're really taking people who are completely broken, people whose soul has eroded significantly, and in many ways just gradually helping. It's not, you don't you don't put them together again, you help them put themselves together again, because you want it to be as empowering and emboldening for them, rather than them perceiving that it's just about someone else or some others doing the work. You know, I don't, when I help somebody, I don't think about a year's time from when they last drank and think, well, if they're still not drinking in a year, it's a success story. I go way beyond that. I want to make sure that they're happy, they're prosperous, they're confident, they're readjusting to relationships. They hopefully became a much better brother, sister, son, daughter, husband, wife, etc., work colleague, whatever the case may be. Because stopping drinking is difficult, but staying stopped is the real, challenge. Because even the more famous of the alcoholic fraternity, I've went through periods where they've stopped drinking, but it's making sure that you don't pick it up again that can represent the real difficulty for so many. And it's just a wonderful thing to be. I'm glad I'm out of the active alcoholism that I was so routinely engaged in. But, helping to turn the light on in other people's lives and seeing the gratitude that comes from family is just wonderful. It really is.
I think there's an important part there when you mentioned about that person thanking you for giving their daughter back. It kind of makes me think that, you see the generations through. I look back across the generations of my dad, etc. And like being a dad now, if you kind of think you want to be an influence for your own kids, but there's also the future generation. And trying to shift that culture just even a little bit so that, so that they don't get rooted in it or gripped by it as much. Well,
just according to some reports I've read, it does seem that there's a growing number of people who are at an impressionable age and who would be legally entitled to drink are deciding against it. And I think that's encouraging. Now, again, I would reiterate that I don't have any problem at all with people drinking alcohol. I think at this time in particular, you have to be understanding and sympathetic to the idea that we're in a cost of greed crisis. And as a result of that, at times people will want to absent themselves from the various predicament and precarious positions that they find themselves in. And I think, as we all know, alcohol is very good at taking you away from those present realities. So people using alcohol insofar as they think it might be helpful for them, and Simon obviously spoke about the aftermath of his dad's passing, and people will use alcohol in times of adversity, but I certainly couldn't put forward any theory that it was only in times of adversity that I drank alcohol or drank to excess. And you made the point, Dave, a few moments ago, about your dad as well, and the notion of depression and things like that. What alcoholics tend to be very good at doing is citing some form of adversity or some significant event in life and saying, well, the reason I'm drinking heavily is because of depression, right? I've done this, right? The reason I'm drinking a lot is because I'm depressed. No, Kieron, the truth is, the reason you're depressed is because you're drinking a lot. And there was so many things in life. And when we talk about the key cornerstone of recovery being the capability and capacity for honesty, sometimes downright brutal, hurtful honesty, then that's just one example of it. And at times people would say, well, the reason I'm drinking so much is because my boss doesn't appreciate me. The reason I'm drinking so much is because he or she won't stop nagging me at home. Well, why do you think they're nagging you? Well, probably because I'm drinking too much. So we have to understand what our source is and what the symptoms stemming from it are, and not consciously or deviously change them to suit what our alcoholic voice is very convincing.
That always stuck with me. The conversation we had, what was it, 10 years ago now, or 2015, wasn't it? Something like that. Yeah, so going on 9 years. It always stuck with me, the comment you made about anxiety and alcohol, and how, people might say, well, I'm drinking because I feel anxious, but actually how much of that is the alcohol causing the anxiety. And that's always stuck with me.
Don't get me wrong. If someone's mental health is generally between reasonable and good, and they go and they have a particularly stressful day at work, they might decide spontaneously to go to the pub that night and have a few glasses of wine or a couple of pints in a way that they ordinarily wouldn't. And if you ask them and they say, well, I've had a particularly stressful day at work, I mean, I would never say you're being dishonest or you're in denial. Of course not. In the majority of cases, there will be a veracity to it. But certainly with regards to alcoholism, and sometimes I internally laugh when I have people trying to convince me of certain things that I'm dealing with. Well, no, the only reason, the other one I get sometimes is, I don't really think I've got a problem with alcohol per se. I think the problem I have is when I drink and then they'll say whiskey or vodka, and I'll say, okay, right, and I'll take them at face value to an extent, and then I'll do a little bit more probing or ask them a few questions, and it becomes very evident within a short period of time that they might not have been consciously lying, but part of what you learn as you go on within sobriety is the ways to eke out relevant information that would allow you to make a diagnosis, or you to say, look, based on everything that you've told me. In fact, at times, sometimes you make a diagnosis based on the things that they haven't told you. I sometimes will get people, because I'm very open, because I speak publicly about it, I sometimes get people almost randomly trying to convince me that they're not an alcoholic, and I might not necessarily know the person that well. I might have been introduced to them, they know who I am, they know I'm a recovering alcoholic, and they'll instigate a conversation by saying, I've not had a drink for 9 weeks, and I'll say, well, that's okay. And what they're wanting then from me is to say, oh, well, if you've not had a drink for 9 weeks, you can't be an alcoholic. Now, what they don't always appreciate is that by telling me they've not had a drink for 9 weeks, they're possibly leading me to believe that they are an alcoholic. You don't disprove alcoholism by not drinking. You disprove alcoholism by drinking alcohol and proving you can drink like the majority of people. I've not drank alcohol now for almost 15 years. I'm still a 24 carat Champions League grade A elite level alcoholic. Fortunately, I'm no longer a drunk. I'm still an alcoholic insofar as if the four of us in this room were to go up to the local hostelry and put down a pint of lager each, the three of you would be able to return to work after lunch. I would still be in that pub in about 3 weeks' time if they allowed me to stay. And all of that can come from one drink. So it's simply not something I would be willing to risk. Sometimes people say, well, it's Christmas Day, Kieron. Surely you can have a little brandy. No.
I got asked this question when I decided to quit alcohol for those 3 years. And it's like, oh, but you will be having a drink at occasions. And I was like, well, it doesn't work like that. This isn't a switch on and switch off. I have to do this. It's not like, because exactly the reason what you've just said is because I knew if I had that one drink, it wouldn't be a one drink. It just would. So people's perceptions as well, where fortunately I came to that point in life where I couldn't be influenced. There was nobody that could influence me to have a drink in any way. And it's just, it's that perception. I was interested to know like what the tipping point was, and and what the steps were when you decided between that 2008 and 2009. Mine was, I went off to Hamsley Forest and I listened to an audio book. Now, that's not for everybody. But for people listening to this right now and going, oh, this really resonates. I get everything that Kieron says. Well, what's your advice? Where do you go? Where, like, I went to Andy's Man Club like before Christmas. Okay, we've all got Google. We can all search. But where should guys go to make that first step?
Well, just going back to something you'd mentioned a few moments ago, Simon, you mentioned more than once the notion of the tipping point. In the penultimate day of my drinking, I'd woken up at 2:30 in the morning and there was no alcohol immediately available to me. And at that particular point, because at that particular time of the morning there wouldn't be anywhere open within close proximity, I contemplated drinking the aftershave that I had in my house because I was under the impression that it contained alcohol. And I would drink the aftershave in the hope, because this is what it all boils down to. You know, the reason people drink alcohol is to change the way they feel, even temporarily, even if they're not alcoholic. Okay, you might enjoy the taste, but as strange as it might sound, there's no alcoholics drink alcohol because of the two things that people normally put any liquid into their system for: thirst or taste. Is to change the way we feel because we don't like life, and that becomes increasingly apparent as time goes on. But the episode with the aftershave, you know, and the thought process around that and the fear that it created later that day, which carried on into the next day, was quite overbearing in a what would turn out to be a good way, simply because that it made me think, Kieron, you were actually thinking about drinking aftershave, not as a dare, not as a bet. You were actually thinking about drinking it because alcohol in the way that it's traditionally consumed was inaccessible. Is it not? Does this not reinforce and hammer home again that things have dramatically changed? And it did create a fear, so much so that in the first few days of recovery, to try to ensure that I wouldn't drink, I was taking a little miniature bottle of aftershave that I had in my pocket, so that if I did think about going to get alcohol from an off-licence or pub, I could look at this miniature bottle of aftershave and think, Kieron, this is where your relationship with alcohol is taking you. And, you know, thankfully, after a few days or a week or so, I no longer felt the need to take this about with me, and by that time I'd re-entered recovery. But to answer your query, you know, people can do all particular different types of things, and you know, there's rehabs, there's detoxes that are available to people. You can go through a GP, you can go to organisations that are within your locality. In Sunderland, for example, there's NERAF and there's Weir Recovery and Smart Recovery. And then, of course, the one that's often held as the standard bearer is AA. You know, so people have got their own options in front of them. Nobody can say that they don't have options within their respective communities, because there's plenty. But almost regardless of whatever path you take, sobriety in the first instance is a state of mind. And if you're determined and resolute enough, you can take yourself into the position where others then can share their experiences, and between different features and facets, it will result in something good and something positive. And, you know, it's the best way, I believe, that you can, you know, take those broken souls and reunite them and allow them to fulfill the undoubted potential that they have. You know, you're not simply taking people off a park bench or off a street corner and simply taking the alcohol away from them. You know, you're taking them through a process of transformation where they will change and become whether it's the father, the mother, the worker, the boss, whatever that was always in there, but was being so seriously stifled by this particular illness. And it's a wonderful thing to be, a part of. So there's various options that people could embark upon. And the most important thing is take the first step. You can't do any steps without the first one. But sadly, it's not always, irrespective of my experiences, and even if people think what I say has merits, quite often it's only the pain that acts as the catalyst to take the first steps. And that was certainly my experience. I was selfish even by alcoholic standards. When other people were suffering in a significant way as a result of my alcoholism, I was potentially dismissive of it. But I would like to think that the people who were suffering have also benefited from my eventual recovery, and long may it continue.
I've got one last question, and I've got my thoughts on this. What's your thoughts on willpower?
Willpower, I suppose there would be similarities with my thoughts on confidence. It can be a wonderful thing. It can be a significant driving force for people to achieve all manner of things. But I know of alcoholics who have climbed some of the world's highest mountains. And I know alcoholics who have went to the extremes of temperature. And I know alcoholics who have engaged in all manner of, ultra marathons or extreme triathlons. Now, those very same people in those respective challenges probably got to a period where their mind, their body, or both was screaming at them to stop. And certainly in the case of mountains, to perhaps go down where you would be able to acclimatise yourself to more natural forms of breathing and the like. And those people found the willpower to go on and complete their respective challenge. That's something I could never, ever, ever do. I couldn't imagine myself completing anything like the aforesaid. But the very same people cannot put down an alcoholic drink and say, I'm going to leave it there. Because some of the people that I'm speaking about had the willpower to ascend to some of the world's highest mountains, but they don't have the willpower to put down an alcoholic drink and not pick it up again. So willpower, generally, a good thing. Willpower has probably helped some of the world's greatest athletes achieve what they went on to achieve. It's probably helped being a driving force for some of the world's greatest business figures or political figures to achieve what they've achieved. But in the context of alcoholism, it is something that simply should not be relied upon. Because willpower to me is, in the first instance, implies somebody doing something on their own, and alcoholism isn't something to be challenged on your own. It just isn't. Many people have tried, and most of them have died. Sadly.
It was a very leading question, one which I 100% agree with what you've just said, because I think it's such a, I don't know, I got a lot, and throughout different challenges, a lot of people saying, oh, you've got amazing willpower. And I find it a very short-term thing, which is pretty much what you've just said there, to get you over the line, to finish that race. And in terms of alcohol, and a lot of long-term things. It just, in my opinion, it's very short-term, and it's if you're relying on willpower, you're ready to fail at some point. If you're purely relying on willpower, and that's the reason why I asked the question, because a lot of people will say, "Wow, amazing willpower," and I just think I think on its own, it's you've got to bring other elements into it.
Yeah, it becomes a cliche, to speak about somebody with, exceptional willpower. I mean, as a footballer, in fact, sometimes when I coach younger players, at times when I do, I feel something of a fraud, because so many of the things that I advise them to do are the things that I wasn't particularly good at, because for those that aspire to be footballers and who will become footballers, it will be somewhere in the region of 90 to 95% of them that will have to consciously put effort in, whereas I never had any. I didn't put any conscious effort in, because if I said that, even if it was an attempt to sound humble, it would be false, because the very essence of being naturally gifted at something is that you don't have to put as much effort in as other people. However, within football, it can be a little bit different, because you're coming up against people who are physically trying to stop you and mentally trying to impair you so that your confidence might take a jolt. So, I think if I was ever going to get to the very, very top and sustain it, I was going to have to bring some form of more positive attitude or application, or if people call it will or drive, to the table. But I would agree with you, Simon, just doing it on will and will alone, I don't know about it. Pain, with the recovery, pain was the driving force for me. Pain can, make people do a lot of things that will bring about change. So,
brilliant.
Yeah.
Kieron, it's been a great conversation.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Really insightful. Moving, actually, a couple of points for me. We like to close the conversation with a question about, is there an item or something from your past that has some meaning or significance to you, whether it's a piece of clothing? For me, it's an old rucksack with Iron Maiden transfer on, that kind of thing. Brings a smile back. Is there something that you have in your past that it means something to you?
Well, given where we are, and given that I'm often asked to engage in podcasts or interviews primarily because of my footballing past, but also the recovery from alcoholism, then when I was an 18-year-old footballer at Sunderland, and very much as a product of my upbringing, which was very left-leaning and left-wing and anti-this and anti-that, a lot of the things that I didn't know the finer points of. But when I was 18 years old, which would have been in the autumn of 1989, I went into training at Sunderland Football Club wearing a green T-shirt that had a silhouette of a man in yellow with a spear, and it said across the top, African National Congress. And my uncles had been campaigning for the release of Nelson Mandela long before many people here actually knew who he was. And at that particular time, the Thatcher government would have been pro-apartheid and very sympathetic to the South African regime. And ironically, in a sense, at this moment in time, we have another government that I would see as pro-apartheid. And when I went into training, some of my teammates and colleagues, manager, were bewildered at why this 18-year-old boy from Coatbridge with an Irish background was wearing this T-shirt to show sympathy and solidarity with the then imprisoned Nelson Mandela and the ANC and the anti-apartheid struggle. And, I could understand some of the views that were coming from other people, which would have been quite disparaging and ignorant in many respects, because they were getting so much of their information from some of the right-wing trashy press. And don't get me wrong, I wasn't politically adept. I was still green and headstrong in many respects, but I had an understanding that apartheid was wrong. You know, to treat a constituency of people as badly as they were being treated. And despite all of the curt remarks that may have came from others, or the downright hostility that may have emerged from one or two, I was firm in my views that what I was doing was simply showing solidarity or support in a very, very, very minute way to people that were disenfranchised. And what, you know, and of course you might smile because, you know, within a matter of time, Nelson Mandela was released and South Africa had embraced democracy. But perhaps the icing on the cake in many ways was that back in about 2014 or 2015, Sunderland Football Club entered into a sponsorship deal where emblazoned across the front of their strip was the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So it might have taken 1/4 of a century to feel as if you were on the right side of history. But I would be, you know, inside I would be, you know, smiling at something like that. So, but there's been other things, you know, but, you know, that would certainly be something that would... you know, that's stroking the beard. So
Love that.
Yeah,
Love that.
absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
No,
It's
thank
been
you. Thank you
absolutely
very much
wonderful.
for asking me.
Really appreciate that. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed the episodes and got something from that. If you did, we would love you to share our podcast.
And if you're not already, subscribe to the show and leave us a rating and a review. That really helps spread the word.
We'd also like to thank our podcast producer, Benoit, for doing a sensational job.
And thanks to the awesome Logan Nicholson of musicformakers.com for the music for the podcast. Catch you in the next episode.
Thanks, guys.